So in this chapter, we try to understand how to measure in the labor market, right? So we started with this circle. What is this circle? This is defined as adults population, but to be precise, 16 and plus, non-institutionalized, and the civilian population. Right, so there are three requirements to consider inside this circle. Right, so this is our starting point. So roughly for the US, roughly there are around 210 or 220 million people. This is not a total population. This is our starting point. Now, given this adults population, we are going to classify them first, those in labor force versus those are not in labor force. What is considered as labor force? See, these two, these are in labor force. And then who is considered as in labor force? Either you employed here, or you are not, you are unemployed. But what do we consider class? So who are classified as unemployed? And technically you don't have a job, but you are actively searching for a job. Right? So E plus U is considered as labor force. And then so you have people not in labor force, that's here. And then so we have discussed two measures. Measure number one, these actually give you the unemployment rate, number of unemployed divided by the number of people in labor force. So this is including employed and unemployed, that's number one. But at the same time, we also define the labor force participation. So that's defined here. Okay, labor force participation. On the numerator, that's the numbers of people in labor force. In the denominator is the adult population. You may be wondering why we look at these two measures. Okay, just give you an example. If someone, let's look at here, if there's one individual, let's use the dots to represent. This individual lost a job and was actively looking for a job, right? Then, so this individual is going to count towards the unemployment rate. Now, say for example, for some reason, so this individual feel a little bit desperate or just too discouraged and decide quit to looking for a job. Now, suddenly this individual is going to classify as not in labor force. Now, if we still look at unemployment rate only, what happens? So then, so the numerator is going to -1, right? Because this individual is not classified as unemployed anymore. And the denominator also subtract 1 because this individual is not in labor force anymore, right? Because look at this equation. The denominator is usually it's going to be larger compared to the numerator, right? And then mathematically, so if you subtract 1 from the numerator and denominator, what happened to the total fraction? It's going to decrease, right? This is simple math. Okay, this is going to decrease. Or in other words, someone feel discouraged and they give up to searching for a job. It's going to artificially reduce the unemployment number. It may give you illusions that the economy is doing well, but as a matter of fact, the economy is doing worse because people just feel there's no hope to find a job. So, but however, if you look at this number, and then you're going to have a different story. So now what happens? Yes, you're going to subtract 1, but the adult population is not going to change. Right? So now you're going to see the labor force participation rate falls. Or in other words, by looking at these two numbers together, we have a more complete picture regarding the health of the labor market. On the one hand, unemployment rate is declined, but on the other hand, labor force participation rate is also declined. That's indication the labor market is getting worse and the people lost their hope in the labor market. It's not, if you only look at unemployment rate, you feel, okay, so the labor market is getting better. So that's why we look at these two numbers together. This is clear. But as a matter of fact, even these two numbers themselves are not sufficient. Now let's see what happens or what is missing from these two important indicators. They are important, but they are not complete. Right. So now let's see. So what's the better picture to look at? Right. So those are things we have discussed, right? So unemployment rate, labor force participation rate. And this is the equation that I just reviewed, right? Labor force participation rate and unemployment rate. Okay. We have seen this practice question before, right? That's very straightforward. And we also look at it here, right? So why unemployment rate may not be a perfect indicator. It could overstate. But actually, as a matter of fact, most of the time we was worried about it may understate. Why it overstate? It's because someone is trying to looking for a better job, both in terms of the career path or in terms of location or in terms of family reason. And this individual may prefer to temporarily stay unemployed, but it's going to pick up by the unemployment rate. Right? So in that sense, unemployment rate overstate the problem. But we care more about understate. What's understate? So this is because the unemployment rate is not going to capture those three type of problems or three type of particular workers. Number one, discourage. This is an example I just gave to you. Someone give up to looking for a job because he or she lost hope. It's just too desperate to search for a job. They just lose the confidence, lose the hope, lose the belief in terms of the labor market. Right. Second type is called marginally attached worker. So this is someone who discouraged, but still is hanging on there. Right, but now look at what's in the parentheses. So this individual has searching for a job in the past 12 months, but not in the past 4 weeks. So why these two numbers matters? Because if you have actively searching for a job in the past 4 weeks, you classify it as unemployed. But this particular individual, we call it as marginally attached worker. Is because he or she has not actively searched in the past 4 weeks, because he or she feel a little bit discouraged. But this individual has not completely give up. She or he has trying to search for a job in the past year. But again, so this individual is not going to show up in the unemployment rate because she or he is not considered as unemployed. Now, the third one is called underemployed worker. This is particularly prominent issue for younger worker and for lower income worker. Now let's see, so who is classified as underemployed? Those are people who work part-time because they cannot find full-time. Right? There's sometimes people may just work for 2 part-time or even 3 part-time. Right? It's not desirable. It's not desirable for them. Right? For at least for a couple of reasons. Number one, part-time usually pay lower. Number two, part-time is probably in terms of scheduling, is a little more complex. Right? And then number three, that's particularly relevant for the US labor market. Part-time worker usually don't offer certain compensation, right? Like health insurance. As a matter of fact, that's the main reason why some employer, they create a more part-time, or they are more likely to offer part-time instead of full-time job. Because if they offer full-time job, usually they are required to provide certain benefit. All right. Okay, so those are three type of workers. So the unemployment rate will not pick up, but they do exist, and their existence actually is going to highlight the problem of the labor market, but they did not pick up by the unemployment rate. Right? So we can look at the data to see what happens. So this is the unemployment rate, but we use different measures from 1994 to 2014. At the very bottom, this one, use here, this line is unemployment rate. That's use official definition we use. But now if we consider first some discouraged worker, you can see the problem is worse. And you should know this. The gap between two is here, okay? 2 is here. This is 2, right? Or this 2. Okay. The gap between 2 and 1 is going to give you the numbers of discouraged worker, right? And then so the gap actually getting bigger when the recession is deep. So from this time period, 1994 to 2014, so there's one episode of recession is pretty deep, so which is financial crisis, right? So we call it Great Recession. And you can see the gap is pretty large. So meaning, so there are more people get discouraged or just lose their hope in this deep recession, right? So let me erase here, just trying to highlight, or you can see better. Okay, so I'm saying, so the difference between the bottom 2 line widen, right? And for the rest of the time, and particularly, so if the economy is in expansion, when the unemployment rate is low, they're almost the same. When recession comes, and when recession getting deeper, meaning so we are moving to the depths of the recession, and then so the gap is getting bigger. But this is very intuitive, right? Because if once we hit to the bottom of the recession, so you lost a job and you have been trying for months or for years, and then so you're more likely to lose your hope. Does that make sense? So that's actually show up in the data, right? Just look at here. Okay. Now, furthermore, we add marginally attached worker. But again, so the gap means here, now we are talking about the gap between this line and this line. So that's going to give you the numbers of marginally attached. Those who has not searching for a job in the past 4 weeks, meaning they are not technically classified as an employee, but they have tried in the past year. But again, so this particular type of worker, so their number is going to increase when the recession is deep. Right? Now, finally, if we consider the involuntary part-time worker, and then the gap is getting even bigger. Right? To summarize, so unemployment rate gives us a good indicator of the health of labor market, but not sufficient. And we should look at the other 3 different types, right? Discouraged, marginal attached, and involuntary part-time worker. Now let's look at this practice question. So we have data in the table. The first part of the question asks you, what is the unemployment rate? So we need to find out the number of unemployed, right? So the number of unemployed in this example equal to labor force subtract employee. Okay, so unemployed equal to 150 minus 138.75. So this is equal to, right? And then so the unemployment rate equal to U divided by labor force. That's equal to 11.25, 150. Okay. So now second part, what is labor force participation? So that's going to be equal labor force divided by the adult population equal to 150 divided by 200. Okay. So then the answer is D. Here's the discouraged worker. It's just a distraction. It just doesn't enter the discussion or doesn't enter the calculation for the two numbers the question asked. Right? Question? No. Now this one is probably more applied or more interesting to look at. Which of the following individuals can be counted as unemployed? Number one, Darren, a 10-year-old. No. Why? He's younger than 16. It's not adult. Number two, Nazma. Is she unemployed? Why? Yes, she's staying home, meaning she doesn't have a job. But to be classified as unemployed, what else you need to require? What else is required? Has she trying to looking for a job in the past of 4 weeks? No. So she's not unemployed. She's not in labor force. Okay. C, Maisha, full-time college student. Is she right? Yeah. Is she a unemployed? No. Why? The same as second one, right? Okay. Now D, Carl, who works part-time at Olive Garden, but would prefer more hours. No. What are we considering him as? Underemployed, right? So he has a job. It's just not desirable. So the answer is E. Okay. Very good. All right, to summarize, unemployment rate is a good indicator. It's not perfect. Okay, so just because of the reason we talk about. And furthermore, besides the reason we just talked about, right? Because it doesn't consider those discouraged, margin attached, and underemployed. And furthermore, it doesn't tell us the quality of job and how we measure the quality of job. One thing we can measure is the real wage, right? Hence, besides unemployment rate, economists also look at other indicators. This include labor force participation. This includes numbers of full-time jobs, and finally look at average wage. Right? So the average wage and the full-time job, this tool is used to give us a measure in terms of the quality of job. Right? Certainly full-time is better than part-time, except you voluntarily, you think you feel better to work part-time. And secondly, usually higher wage and a better job, right? Right. So besides those things, and then so I'm going to show you, I think there are 2 slides, kind of show you the other aspect of the labor market. What we think here, this is the unemployment rate, but we look at unemployment rate by different demographic background. So here, this is the overall. And we look at 3 time period. And clearly you can see what happened in 2010. So we are in the trial of the busy cycle, meaning we are enter the darkest day of the Great Recession. So the unemployment rate, the overall unemployment rate was close to 10%. This is overall. However, if we just look at some subgroup, and then you're going to see different problem or different picture, right? Let's start with the first one, African American. As you can see, the number is much higher, right? Now, if we look at younger population, start with white teenager, and you can see this is much higher. But usually, so the younger kids, so they have hard time to find a job. But then you need to think about why we cares about those subgroup. Let's just first show you the number, and then so we can just briefly talk about why we cares about those subgroup. Okay. Now, finally, if you look at African American teenager, in 2010, almost half of them unemployed. Now the question is why we cares about those subgroup. What are the potential problems this may generate? For some subgroup, they have much higher unemployment rate compared to the other part of this population. What do you think? But first of all, in general, so if the unemployment rate increase, what that means to general population? Certainly it's a bad sense, right? Because you're going to have higher chance to lose your job. You're going to have a lower income, right? So this is bad sense. But now what happened of those subgroup, like teenager, African American, if they have much higher unemployment rate compared to the general population, what are the potential social issues you can think about? Why economists cares about those numbers? But usually this is going to lead to inequality, right? Because there's some group is going to worse off compared to the other. This is number one. And here we also look at younger population, like teenagers. And why the unemployment rate among teenagers is something we pay attention to. Is because for teenagers, some working experience is going to go to a long way to help their career. Right? If they don't have that opportunity to learn, particularly learn from jobs in the early stage of their career or their life cycle, usually they're going to be behind in a later stage. Again, so this is going to translate into more severe inequality over time. So that's why we look at these subgroups. Okay. The other terms, the economists have defined as called jobless recovery. That is the period in which the real GDP growth is positive, but unemployment rate is still rising. So basically, it's referring to here is after the financial crisis. And so we're already out of the wood in terms of economic growth, but the unemployment rate still picking up, not falling, right? Right. Now here, so I'm going to show you the correlation between unemployment rate, which is on the horizontal line, and the real GDP growth. Okay, so we look at the US data since 1949, which is roughly after World War II. And by examining this diagram, we shouldn't have big trouble to identify a pattern, right? What's the pattern? Well, in other words, you can feed a curve here, right? What's the pattern? So essentially it just says when GDP growth is high, which goes to this direction, which goes to this region, usually means unemployment rate is low. When GDP growth rate is low, the unemployment rate is high. So this is how the unemployment rate is correlated with business cycle. Okay. Oh, sorry, but I sort of have one slide. But then why, what is behind the correlation between economic growth and unemployment rate? What do you think? Why GDP growth is slow and then the unemployment rate is high? There are two reasons. Okay. On the one hand, when GDP grows is slow. Okay. And usually, so the demand, usually the demand is low. If the demand is low, and then the firm, they may force to cut their jobs. Does that make sense? Because there's not enough demand for your goods and service. And why would you want to hire so many workers to produce so much? This is one reason, right? On the other hand, reason number two. So during economy is slowing down, or during the contraction, when the economy start to go into a recession, the business, their ability to generate new jobs is going to be hindered, or they are losing their ability to generate more jobs. Right? So these two reasons explain why lower GDP growth implies higher unemployment rate. Right. Okay, let me skip this. Now just go to the second part of this chapter. We are going to look at a different type of unemployment. So this classification is going to help us understand one thing we have noticed earlier in this lecture, why over the long term the unemployment rate never dropped below around 3% in the US. Okay, so this classification is going to help us understand why unemployment rate is never close to zero. Okay. First, economists find out it's best to classify unemployment into three categories. So this including frictional, structural, and cyclical. Now let's see what they mean. Okay, let's just look at it one by one. But before I explain to you, so what each type of unemployment means and how we classify each type of unemployment, let's look at this diagram to understand how people move around in the labor market. Okay, so this is three type of stage in the labor market. One way you can think about it is maybe just consider this like three islands in our economy. Three islands. Okay. And this island has different name. So this is something we already understand, right? So you have people who are unemployed, meaning those who have a job, and those are people who are unemployed, okay, who don't have a job but is looking for a job. And then so you have people not in labor force. At each point of time in our economy, so there are people move between these three islands, right? Let's see so who they are and why they are moving around. Let's start with here, someone employed. And every year, there are many people move from employee to not in labor force, more than 4 million. Who are they? Who move from employee to not in labor force? Who are the majority? People retire. Excellent, thank you. Okay, so those are the majority. But then, so you have small fraction, someone either go to school or someone for family reason just stay at home, right? So this is roughly 4.1 million. Now you have employed goes to unemployed every year, around 1.8 million. So that's very straightforward. Those who get laid off, who lost their job. Right. Okay. Now let's look at here, unemployed. Unemployed. Oh, apologize. So there was a mistake here. Here I was intending to say from employed to unemployed is 1.9 million average, okay, during the regular year. Now for unemployed, you have some goes to employed, meaning they find a job, right? 1.7. Then so you have 1.8 million not in labor force. So this includes those discouraged worker, marginal attached worker, right? Now finally, so you have people not in labor force, and then there's a huge number goes to employed, and some goes to unemployed. Let's start with this one. Who are those 3.9 million people move from not in labor force to employed? Who are the majority in this 3.9 million? Who are they? Kids. Can be more specific. What type of kids? Minor? Oh, okay. So you're thinking about someone turned 16. No, so if someone just turned 16, they were not in, so they are not even classified as not in labor force because they were not adults. But you're very close. Who are they? Who are those 3.9? First of all, in order to classify not in labor force, you must be 16 and above. But who are those big chunk of people who move from not in labor force to employed? You are very close. College graduates. Okay, college graduates, that's a big chunk among the 3.9. They were full-time students, but I know, so in our classroom, there are some already have a job, right? But most of the college students, so they are full-time students. They don't have a job. After graduation, they are going to move from not in labor force to employee. And then there's some of people in this category or in this island, as I use the term. They're going to move to unemployed. There are 1.6 million, right? Because it takes time for them to find a job, even for graduates, even for college graduates, right? Okay, so this is how people moving around among the three islands or three different stages in labor market. Now, let's see three types of unemployment. First one is called frictional. Frictional unemployment exists is because it's going to take time for workers to find out the right job. Okay. Actually, this big background picture is going to give you a good idea what this means. On the left-hand side, there are three adults, right? So they are in labor force, or they are searching for jobs, or maybe a lot in labor force, either way. On the right-hand side is referring to, or here is what we mean, right-hand side. There are three potential jobs or three potential career paths for them to find out, right? And then usually it's going to take time for people to find out what is their comparative advantage, what is their passion, what is their desired career path. That usually it's going to take time. And then, so this time-consuming process usually is going to lead to frictional unemployment. And fundamentally, the existence of frictional unemployment is because of scarcity of information. What is information? From your side, it takes time for you to find out what you're good at, what you are passionate about, right? From the job side, it's going to take time for you to find out where the job is, where the opportunity is. Okay, so this is a scarcity of information. But can we just completely get rid of this scarcity of information? No, scarcity is a starting point of the discussion, right? So there's always a scarcity of scarcity of everything. Otherwise, there's no economics. Okay? This is frictional unemployment. Now, if we look at the unemployment number, and if we look at the duration of unemployment, and then we have a sense who are classified as frictional. Usually, the shorter the duration of the unemployment, the more likely is frictional. Because what's frictional? It just takes time for you to sort out. Now it just takes time for you to find out. Right. So now if you look at here in 2007, okay, so you have 31%, sorry, start with here, 36% less than 5 weeks, 31% 5 to 15 weeks. And this too is probably largely classified as frictional. It just takes time for you to find a job. Right. Now we go to the second type of unemployment. It's called structural unemployment. And what is structural unemployment? First of all, it's defined as the situation when there are more workers or more people is searching for a job in a particular labor market than there are jobs available. But what can cause this situation? There are more supply than demand, essentially. Like who's the supply? The job seeker. For the demand, the employers. Right? So why there are more supply than demand? Right? There are following reasons. Labor union. What is labor union? The example of labor union is an example. So in Michigan, so there's this largest labor union in the United States, which is the auto worker union. What is the purpose of labor union? Maybe go to the next stage. Okay. Why they need a union? So union essentially is an association. So they are going to bargain on behalf of the worker. To what? To bargain for higher pay, better working conditions. But this bargaining process or this union can artificially, yes, their goal is going to try to increase the salary. But this salary increase is going to artificially create structural unemployment. So this graph is going to help us understand what happened. Equilibrium wage, this is without union. Now with union, again, so their goal is trying to improve the well-being of the worker. They're trying their best to raise the wage. Right? Here is a minimum wage, but it's similar, right? So union may also bargain for minimum wage. They artificially lift up the wage. Now, what's going to be the consequence? Or what is the unintended consequence? This is going to create structural unemployment. So why? Because now the labor supply is going to exceed labor demand. And then the gap is unemployment. And we classify this as structural unemployment. And from here, you can see so the structural unemployment, the cause is different from frictional unemployment. What caused the frictional unemployment is because of the lack of information, the scarcity of information. What is the cause of structural unemployment? It's because, like so far we discussed, it's because they are forced artificially pushed up the wage rate, right? Now we have other reasons. Efficiency wage. What is efficiency wage? To understand efficiency wage, now just think about the following scenario. If the labor market will clear or you, in other words, if there's no scarcity of information, if there's no union, okay, so that means you're going to instantaneously clear the labor market, meaning you will always find a job. Not just imagine if you can always find a job. What would be your work incentive? Will you work hard in a current job or not? Just imagine if you can always find a job. Do you care? You shook your hand, right? So that's correct answer. Why you don't care? Why you may not work hard?
I can just find a new job.
Because there's no cost, there's no punishment. I'm going to find a job immediately. If I lose my job, I don't care, right? Is this a good news for the employer? No. And then what the employer can do. So throughout practice, so they find a genius solution, which we call efficiency wage. What is the efficiency wage? So the employer, as a response to the potential short, meaning so the worker may not put enough effort because they knew they're going to find a job somewhere else, even though you fire him or her. And then employer, as a response, they artificially raise the wage. By artificially raise the wage, and then so they artificially create unemployment. And then this is like the employer, they create a stick, right? So now there's potential punishment for you if you don't work hard. Okay, so this is efficiency wage, right? But then so clearly, so this efficiency wage creates unemployment, and this type of unemployment we call structural, right? So this is the second example. Now, third possible cause of structural unemployment is some government policy. This including minimum wage, but similar to union. But now this is also caused by government policy, say globalization. The globalization, they can outsource some jobs to abroad, right? Also, the globalization or the technological progress can lead the firm to adopt some new technology, like automation, right? And then so with automation, the capital or the machine is going to replace some of the jobs. So that immediately create a gap between the demand and the supply, right? So there's another example of structural unemployment, right? So those are the cause for structural unemployment. And clearly, so the reason behind the structural unemployment is different from frictional. Now, we have a third type of unemployment. What is this? Everything else, right? Because we have three categories, right? So we understand the first two, and then whatever is left, we classify as the third one. See these. Oh, sorry. And then whatever is left is called a frictional. Okay. Or in other words, so we have two equations. Sorry. Start with the bottom one. Actual unemployment includes natural unemployment plus cyclical. But what is natural? Natural is a combination of frictional and structural. Remember, there are three types of unemployment, right? So friction number one, structure number two, cyclical number three. So the first two, we put them together, called natural. And then whatever is not natural, and then we call it cyclical. And you may be wondering why we call them natural. So essentially it's because it's natural to the fundamental of the economy. Remember, so what is the frictional? Because scarcity of information, it is natural, right? So scarcity is the beginning of the discussion of economics. And structural, why it's natural? Just two examples, union and the efficiency wage, right? Because so people always want to behave on their basic interests. So the union is trying to bargain for you. It is natural. And you do not want to work hard. You just behave on your basic interest. It is natural. Right, so that's why we call this the first two as natural unemployment. This natural unemployment always exists because of the existence of friction, because of existence of this structural problem. So that explains why the unemployment rate is never below 2.9% in the US after World War II. Okay, the rest will go to cyclical. Okay, actually, this cyclical is largely correlated with business cycle. Okay, now let's go back to the slide we just skipped. So here we look at many countries inside OECD. OECD stands for Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. So essentially, it's a club of advanced economy. And among those countries, we look at their natural unemployment rate in 2013 and rank them. In the middle, this is OECD average or the group average. The United States is here, is lower than average. Now in the far right, you have Spain, which is very high. Okay. Now the question for you is, why there's some country has much higher natural rate of unemployment than the other? What are the potential causes of a higher natural rate of unemployment? To answer that, so always remember what are the reasons behind those unemployment, right? One is frictional, the other is structural. In general, there are two explanations. Number one, if some country has less or has worse technology in terms of help the worker to find a job, will this country has higher frictional or lower frictional unemployment? You don't know. Let me say it again, okay? Just compare two countries or even one country. In one country, so they have better technology to help workers to find a job, to think about internet. The other country, they don't have the technology. And then this is going to be very costly for you to find a job. Now, under which case the frictional unemployment is lower? Is the question clear? You understand the difference between these two countries? Which one has lower frictional unemployment? No, sorry? Right, the one has better technology, right? Because the scarcity of information is going to be so partially sorted out by better technology. Now, the other reason why the natural rate of unemployment is higher for those countries on the far right. If, again, so compare two countries. One country is more towards socialism or towards left-leaning. The other one is towards more right-leaning, meaning, to be precise, so one country has more protection to workers, has more social benefits to workers versus the other. And then, so which one has more structural unemployment? The one with more benefit or less benefit? Anyone? Is that clear? Is the question clear? So you see the difference between these two countries, right? One has more protection or better compensation to worker versus the other, or better protection to worker versus the other. This is like you have better union compared to the other, right? And then so naturally, so this one is going to have higher structural unemployment, right? So that's explained. So the country on the far right, why they have higher natural rate of unemployment for two reasons: lack of a better technology and a more protection. Right, so you can see this is like a double-sided sword, right? On the one hand, you help them who have jobs, On the other hand, you create more unemployment. Right. So there's a balance, there's a trade-off the policymaker is facing. Okay. Now let's look at this practice question. Jasmine has recently moved to Florida because she loved the warm weather there. Being new to the area, she will need to spend a few weeks looking for a new job. This is an example of frictional, right? So this is a perfect example of frictional. It just takes time. Okay. So we encourage you to watch this video because we're kind of behind the schedule. So I encourage you to watch, but essentially in this video, so they give us a clear example of underemployed worker, marginally attached worker, and a discouraged worker. And furthermore, this is a clear example to show us those three types of worker. The number of those types of worker is going to pick up when the recession getting deeper and deeper. Right? Okay, just keep those questions in mind when you watch this video. But it's a very good video to help you understand those three types of unemployment, or the problem, the unemployment rate did not pick up. Right, so we have seen this before, right? So I just review this one. So to summarize, the three types of unemployment. Okay, and then so we classify the combination of the first two as natural, and everything else goes to cyclical. Again, cyclical essentially is something to do with the business cycle. Right, and the cyclical unemployment is the unemployment correlated with the business cycle, and usually the cyclical unemployment pick up when we are in recession, and it goes down when we are in the expansion. And finally, so this kind of link to the early discussion I had, why unemployment rate pick up when growth is low? Two reasons. Reason number one, GDP falls, firm lay off. Why they lay off? Because the demand is weak. They cannot sell the goods and service they produce. Why would they need so many workers? Number two, the firms has a smaller ability to generate more jobs. This is like a growth, right? Like your body is growing. The same for our economy is growing. But in recession, they lack the ability to generate more jobs. Okay, this is kind of stock versus flow. Okay. All right. Now, you may wondering, so what can change the natural rate of unemployment? Is this natural rate of unemployment constant over time, the same across country? The answer is no, right? But then, so what can cause it to change? There are three reasons. Number one, there may be a change in the characteristics of labor force. Maybe there's a change in demographics, right? Just think about the baby boomer generation. When they first entered the labor market, and clearly there was a structural unemployment, the supply exceeded demand. But then, so when they leave the labor market, what would you expect about the structural unemployment? When they leave the labor market, actually this is happening right now. When baby boomer generation start to retire, and then the supply of labor is cannot meet with the demand, right? Because there are a big chunk of the labor force enters retirement. They are leaving the labor force. So the supply cannot keep up with demand. And then the structural unemployment is going to decline. Okay, reason number one. Reason number two, change in labor market institution. This including union, including government agency helps worker to find job or new technology, right? So this is going to change the structural unemployment. And finally, changes in government policy. So for example, there's a job training program to help workers who lost their job, to gain new skills, or to gain some expertise to find new job. So that's going to reduce the structural unemployment, right? All right, so here it's interesting to look at the labor force participation rate among women and men. This is after 1948 or after World War II. What we find out is the women's labor force participation rate almost double, but the men's kind of eventually, so first pick up and eventually gradual decline. Okay, so this is very interesting phenomenon. But what are the reasons behind these patterns? What would be your guess? So the fact is after World War II, there are more women go out looking for job. And then, so in terms of the male or men, so their labor force participation, apologize, okay. So this is not for men, but if you look at the men, actually, so let me draw a diagram. For men, their labor force participation rate is kind of like here, is declining. Women is increasing, men is declining. Right? But what are the potential explanation behind this? What would be your guess? What causes more women go out looking for jobs? And this actually happens after World War II. But at the same time, so the other thing that we find out is for younger worker, their labor force participation rate also kind of declined after World War II. What would be the reason behind these two trends? Start with female. Let me give you a hint. So some technology. The technology to free you from housekeeping. Like technology, say the example of technology including vacuum, washing machine, dishwasher. How would that affect the labor force participation rate among women? How those things can affect the labor force participation rate? Why the increase? That's good. That's a good answer. Why it would increase? Right. So they are joined. So very close. So basically, because of the availability of those technology, it's going to increase the opportunity cost for those women to stay at home. Why? Because these things can be cheaply or efficiently, those jobs can be efficiently and cheaply done by this machine, right? So increase the opportunity cost. At the same time, so there's like the closing of gender gap in terms of the wage pay. So it's also further increase the opportunity cost of staying at home. So that's why there are more women go out and enter the labor force. Right. Now look at the younger cohort, why their labor force participation rate declined. This is related to the premium for education. How that affects, or how this is related, is because with technology progress, and then the higher education is going to brings you more and more wage gain compared to a less educated. Hence, people prefer to stay longer in school or to receive better education before they enter the labor force, right? So those are two trends. All right, so now let's look at this practice question, and then so we probably should move to the last topic in this chapter. Which of the following is true? A, the natural rate of unemployment equal to the unemployment rate during recession. That's not correct, right? B, natural rate of unemployment equal to the unemployment rate during expansion. It's the same mistake as A. C, natural rate of unemployment is a sum of frictional and structural. Okay, so that's C, right? So this is by definition. Okay. All right. So now we go to the last topic of this chapter. We are going to look at inflation and deflation. Okay. So inflation indeed draws lots of attention. And we loosely know it's going to hurt the economy, but why? Why it hurts our economy? So one way to look at that is you can look at these two definitions. Okay, so what is this two definition about? Real wage and real income. So what is real wage? Real wage is wage divided by price level. And why we look at real wage? But actually, so the other things, the concept opposite to real wage is called nominal wage. Or you can think about just here, just like here, the wage rate actually is nominal wage. So the difference between nominal wage and a real wage is that we get rid of the inflation. Because when you divide by price level, you will kind of get rid of inflation from your nominal wage growth. And similarly, real income is the income divided by price level. And why we care about that is because if your income grow at the same time as the price rise, your purchasing power is going to decline, right? So that's why we look at real wage, and that's one way why inflation hurts us, because inflation is going to eat away part of your purchasing power. Okay, and by the way, so here's the inflation rate. Okay? So how we calculate the inflation rate? So this is something we already done in the previous chapter, right? So inflation rate equal to the percentage change in price level. Okay, so the formula goes as follows. You use so these two actually is a change. Let's use delta as change in price level, and divided by price level in this is kind of like in base year. So this is inflation rate. The change in price level, percentage change in price level. The 100 is normalization. That's going to give you the percentage, right? Example, the price level here is CPI, okay, increase from 120 to 135. What is the inflation rate? And then we use the formula, okay, 135 subtract 120 divided by 120. So this is the percentage. Okay. You may want to review how we calculate CPI. So that's what we discussed in previous chapter, right? Okay. So this is inflation rate. Right. And this is how the actual data looks like. This green line is the price level. Again, to review how we calculate the price level. So essentially, we just keep track the cost of a basket, right? So that's how we get the price level. Now, the inflation rate essentially is a percentage change. Is a percentage change of price level from 1 year to the other year. Right? This is the inflation rate for the US after 1960. Right? So before 1980, or even before, like, yeah, so I think before 1980, there was a time period the inflation was very high. Okay. And then since then, I mean, particularly after 2000, so the inflation was fairly low. Right. And so let me just explain to you something is related to the current affair. If we look at it here, 2009, so the inflation went to a negative. There was deflation. Well, if there's deflation, and things can getting very bad. Why? If the price level keep falling, just ask yourself, do you want to spend or you want to postpone your spending? You want to postpone. Why? Because things getting cheaper and cheaper. If things getting cheaper and cheaper, which means if there's inflation, you don't want to spend. Now, if the economy is not doing well, if everyone want to postpone their spending, are we going to have a worse recession or are you getting better? You are going to make the recession worse. So this is what happened in 2009. And then so in 2020, most of the economists, I think pretty much everyone has the same mindset. They was thinking, okay, so we are heading to a deflation. All right. And that's why so the Fed decided to, you probably hear from the news, the Fed decided to stimulate. But then so took a surprise to everyone, so we have inflation. So now that kind of explains why inflation is out of control. Because when we first saw some sign of inflation in 2021, everyone was believed, which they just look at it here, they believe the inflation will go down very quickly. But turns out it's different. And then in 2020, in late of 2021 and early 2022, the Fed started to raise the interest rate. They're trying to push down the inflation. But then when they raise the interest rate, and then so the economy starts to see some trouble. So that's kind of linked to the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, right? Okay, so to fully understand that, so maybe we need to wait a little bit until we understand the monetary policy. But for now, make sure you understand how we calculate inflation. Okay. Now here, so this slide explains to you why we cares about inflation, or what is the cause of inflation. The first cause we call shoe leather cause. They just a paragraph, they just a name. Okay, so just tell you what this means. So essentially, it just says if there's high inflation, and the people is going to rush through the bank to withdraw the cash, to buy goods, to avoid higher price. But certainly, modern days, you can just withdraw your cash or you get the cash from your cell phone. But still, the cost exists because you're going to pay more attention to price change. You're going to spend more time to do this transaction compared to a scenario when inflation is stabilized, right? Here's an example when the shoes leather cost can be very high. Back in 1985, the inflation in Israel went to 500%. And then, so you can see from this picture, people just line up in ATM, right? So that's very time consuming. Why they line up in ATM? Because they want to withdraw the cash before their cash becomes a useless paper. Okay, so this is one cause of inflation. The other cause is called menu cost. What's the menu cost? You go to a restaurant, usually there's a menu, right? Now, if there's inflation and the restaurant want to break it even, what they must do if there's inflation? Three choices. Keep the price of the menu, raise the price, or decrease the price. What would you do if the owner of the restaurant, if the inflation is high? What would you do? You raise the price, okay? But then, so in order to raise the price, what do you need to do? You need to change your menu. If you change your menu, is there a cost? What is the cost of changing your menu? What's the cost? You need to reprint this, right? This is number one. This is very obvious. But other than that, what are the costs of changing your menu? I'm sorry? Right, so you may lose your customer, right? So this is called menu cost. But anyway, so when they invent this term, menu cost, is largely associated with printing costs. But in modern days, like today, so the printing cost is almost zero. I'll give you two examples. If you go to, I don't know whether you ever pay attention to or not. If you go to Best Buy, or if you go to Furniture Mart of Nebraska, what do they use for their menu or in their price tag? Anyone pay attention? They're electronic. In that sense, there's no cost for them, or zero cost, almost zero, right? So they just change this on the computer and send the signal, and the menu is going to change, right? Okay, but anyway, so they just keep using this name because not only you need to change your menu or just cost the menu change, also it's going to cost some of your customer, because some customer is going to be drive away to the other business, right? So this is second cost. The third cost is the unit of account. Okay. What this means? It just means your people, I mean households, in the worst case scenario, they may abandon to use local currency. It indeed happens in some African country. At the end, because the inflation is so high, they decide to use US dollar. What that means to the government, if everybody use foreign currency. Or just imagine if in the US, nobody use US dollar. They decide to use Mexican peso. What does that mean to US government? If no one uses US dollar, what does it mean to US? What does that mean to US government? Particularly Treasury. So basically, they lose an important source of revenue because by printing money, they generate revenue, right? Because printing money is almost cost-free. It's just a piece of paper. But then, so they just give you a piece of paper, and as a return, so they just purchase goods and service from you. Does that make sense? So actually, money is an important source of revenue. But if inflation is so high, households lose confidence to the government and decide to abandon the use your currency, and then you lose your revenue. So that's the third cause of high inflation. So given the existence of inflation, so it's also going to affect how we calculate interest rate. But what is interest rate? Interest rate essentially is a price you paid as a borrower, or the price the lender is going to charge when lend the money to you. Right? To calculate interest rate or to understand interest rate, let me give you two examples. So number one, if you ever have a credit card, or if you ever have a late payment for your credit card, and the answer usually is going to charge a fee, right? Usually it's probably like 20 something percent. Is that right? Okay, so that, to be precise, if you have 100 outstanding, sorry, what is it called? So something you paid, and then so they're going to charge you, say, if you give them $2 or something like that. So this is called interest rate, right? Now, interest rate, the other way to understand is maybe slightly different, is about treasury bill. Everyone understand what's about treasury bill, right? Treasury bond. No? But you don't understand what is treasury department. Okay, so treasury department, so sometimes they need to borrow, right? Why they need to borrow? So essentially they borrow on behalf of the government. Why they need to borrow? What do you think? Why the government need to borrow? For the spending. Sometimes the tax revenue is not enough. They need to borrow. And then the treasury department, the way they borrow is to issue treasury bond. Okay, how does it work? Usually as follows. Okay, so the treasury bond, they have a face value, which is amount they promise to pay you. Say, for example, you buy a treasury bill with a face value of $100 and mature, let me write down, mature in 1 year. So this means if you purchase today and next year in the same time, you are going to guarantee to get $100. So this treasury bill. But then when you purchase this, usually the price, usually we use Q to know the price. Usually the price is less than $100. Now the difference is going to give you the reward, and the difference is going to give you the interest rate. Say for example, the price you paid to get this $100 treasury bill is $90. And from here, you can calculate the interest rate, right? Or the reward, which is 100 divided by 90 minus 1. Does that make sense? Because it's a percentage of reward you're going to get, right? So this is slightly different from like the credit card interest rate, but this in the same logic. Right? So this is interest rate. Okay, but interest rate, so we need to differentiate between two types. One is nominal interest rate. Like here, so you pay $90 today, and the next year, the Treasury Department is going to promise you $100. From here, you calculate the nominal interest rate. This is roughly around 11%. This is nominal, right? But you also have real interest rate. To help you to understand real interest rate, let me use a numeric example, okay, so that you appreciate the value of numeric interest rate. Okay, just imagine you borrow $100 from credit card for 1 year or for a bank, just simplify. The nominal interest rate is 5%, meaning next year you need to pay back $105. Now, what is real interest rate? To understand real interest rate, we need to consider inflation. So, for example, at the same time, there's 5% of inflation. Okay, now let's see how that matters to you. You borrow $100 today. You can purchase, now let's say for example, okay, so you buy like bottled waters. Let's say the price of bottled water is $1 per bottle. With 105, you can buy 100 bottles. Now next year, you pay the bank $105 because 5% of inflation. The bottled water becomes $1.05 per bottle. And then convert to goods and service, you need to pay back 100 bottled water. What this means to you? What this means to you? I'm sorry? It's higher? So what it means so it's higher? No, my question for you is, so me to be clear. So my question for you is 5% nominal interest rate, 5% inflation. To you, what is the actual cost to borrow $100 from the bank? Does that cost you anything? In this case, yeah.
Borrow, like get a loan?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, but in the real term or in the actual term, does that loan really cost you anything? Look at this example.
No.
Nothing, right? You borrow $100. You with this $100, you can buy 100 bottled water, a bottled water. And the next year, because of inflation, yes, you pay more, which is $105. But then next year inflation, so bottled water is cheaper. You essentially just give them the 100 bottled waters. Nothing. So that is important. So we need to look at nominal and real interest rate. But again, there are more examples come out, right? Okay, so this is a first example. So now let's look at this example. There are two individuals. Mary expects inflation to be 5. She's willing to pay a real interest rate of 3%. Joe expects inflation is 5, and he's willing to lend. If he receive a real interest rate of 3%. Now, if the actual inflation is 6 and the loan contract specify nominal interest rate of 8, look at Mary. But to answer what they feel, first we need to calculate what is the real interest rate. So the key information is here. Nominal interest rate of 8, inflation is 6. What is the actual cost for you to borrow? It's 2%. And then furthermore, what is the actual gain if you save? Same thing, 2%, right? So this means Mary is a bargain because she's willing to pay for 3%. Now it's only 2%. But this means it's not a good thing for Joe because he will save or he will lend out money if he gets 3%. But now it's only 2%, right? So here is to show you the importance of inflation, showing the importance of calculate nominal versus real interest rate. There's another questions to help understand the inflation. In this example, we have 3 individuals. This represent like different people in our real life. Sarah, she works for a firm, automatically adjusts her wage to the annual rate of inflation. Bob works for a firm that grants employees a 5% annual income increase. And Emil retired, has 2 paychecks. One is pension payment fixed at $2,000. The other Social Security is $1,000. But there's important information. Social Security payment is indexed to the inflation. What does that mean? What does inflation index mean? It means it's going to automatically adjust with inflation. All right. Now let's see if there's an inflation of 8% this year. What this means to each individual. Let's start with Sarah. What does that mean to her? 8% inflation. First, what happened to her salary? The key is salary is going to automatically adjust. This means what? What this means? Yes. So she will be fine. She is like protected from inflation. Thank you. Now, what happens to Bob? So he's going to worse off because inflation is 8%. He only get a 5% raise. Right? Now go to Milt. What this means to Milt is he's going to worse off or better off. Why? Remember, Milt has two checks. Actually, you're very close. Milt actually is going to worse off. Why? Because he has 2 income. One is a pension, 2,000. This is not going to change, adjust with inflation. That part of the income is going to suffer. And he has another smaller paycheck from the government that's going to adjust. But overall, he's going to worse off. All right. Is this clear to everyone? Okay. So again, so this example show you 2 important messages. Number one, how inflation matters to each of us. Clearly look at it here. So these 3 individuals represent us, like in different scenario, right? Like in my case, probably fall into Bob, but we will be unlucky compared to Bob because University of Nebraska only raise our salary between 1% and 2% per year. Right? And some firms is like Sarah, like my wife, her company is probably like that, or even better. And then, so you may have your grandparents who are retired and the probably is going to fall into the category of milk. This is number one. Number two, so from this exercise, you should appreciate the value of accurately calculate inflation, right? Because there are so many people, they are going to depending on this accurate number. So they are going to get more or less their paycheck. So there are two important messages we have learned from here. So this is the answer for the question we just for the things we just discussed, right? So in reality, there's some time period the inflation is higher or lower, and usually when the inflation go much higher than you expected, it's good news for borrower. Why? Because in real term, you're going to pay less to the bank. On the other hand, if you're a saver, if you save a lot of money, and then inflation is bad news for you. Now let's look at what happens in history, in recent history. Okay, let's just start with this. I don't know what we call this blue line, or anyway. So this line, what we call this line, right? So what is here? Each dot represent one point in time. Like, say, for example, this dot is August 1974. This dot tells you the state of our economy in August 1974 in terms of labor market and inflation. If I ask you one sentence to summarize the state of the economy in August 1974, what would you say? Just based on this diagram, what is the state of the economy in August 1974 in one sentence? Inflation really high, unemployment very low. Right? Does that sound familiar to you? This is happening right now. Okay, this is pretty much like right now. Okay. If you trace back or trace this line, so this is essentially how the history unfold. Right? Before I show you how the history unfold, let me ask you a question. If you are the state, if you're the head of the government, either the chairman of the Federal Reserve or the president, are you concerned about the economy or not? If you are here, are you concerned about the economy or not? Based on the material we have learned so far, is there anything we need to worry about regarding to the economy? And here, at this dot, like students just says, unemployment rate is low, inflation rate is high. Is there anything we need to worry about? Yes, which is inflation, right? We have just had a discussion about the cause of the high inflation, right? So 10 is really high. And actually this, if you don't act enough, and these things can spiral up very quickly, or it can go out of your control very quickly and very easily. This happened in Venezuela. It happened in Zimbabwe. Right, so this is something to concern. But then, so if you're concerned about the economy, what do you want to achieve? Or what do we want to do at the end? What's the goal here? If we are here, what do you want to achieve? You want to push down the inflation, right? Okay, very good. So now let's see. So how history unfolded itself. This past is pretty much how history unfolded itself. At the end, we got here. If you compare these two dots, we achieved something, right? Inflation declined from 10% to 6%. But what was the cost we paid? Look at this history. Unemployment rate increased a lot, right? So actually, in this case, increased from 5.4% to 9%. This is a cost. right? Actually, this also explains why we put these two things together, which is inflation and unemployment. And actually, this explains why the Fed is trying to strike a balance between inflation and unemployment. Because these two is kind of intrinsically connected with each other. You want to push down one thing, and usually leads to the other things go up before these things go down. This is what happens in history, right? So now if you look at another part of history, which is 1980, the things get even worse. So the inflation is much higher, right? And then the cost we paid is even higher. So look at here. So the the unemployment rate is close to 11% in early 1980. But luckily at then, so we did achieve to push down the inflation. Right? And since then, it's actually since 1980, the inflation in the US was always under control until recently, and things get out of control. To understand what happened recently, so we may wait towards the end of this class to understand what happened. All right. Okay, so there's one more question, and then we finish this chapter. You have just been awarded a cost of living increase tied to CPI. CPI gone from 110 to 112. If your salary is 30,000 before the increase. Now this question asks you, what will it be after CPI increase is factored in? What this means? So it just means your salary is going to increase with CPI. Or in other words, to be precise, your salary is going to be 30,000 times 112 divided by 110. Okay. The answer is B.